All right, apologies for the Zoom link again. It's Brent's meeting, so he didn't transfer ownership to me. All right, Henry, you have first items.
Yeah, hello. So I was trying to think about the next steps a little bit and also what we discovered so far and to try to trim it down to something which is actionable for infrastructure at least, and to define what work can be done already now as next steps, right? And by thinking of this, I found myself, it's nice to structure things in a way that it becomes clear what absolutely is necessary, regardless of which technical solution we end up with. And by thinking about this, I found some facts. One is that regardless of what we are doing, object storage is always the cheapest way to synchronize things across multiple regions, and that includes disk snapshots. And the second thing is, if we want to get an RTO below 1 hour, like for our premium customers, for instance, then disk snapshots wouldn't be the way to go. So these are some hard facts that we have discovered, I think, for possible solutions. And regardless of which solution we are aiming for syncing things, I think what anyway needs to be done as work is first that we need to build down a scaled down copy of gprod, like really in the same topology like we have it in gprod, because we need to be able to do deployments to upgrade our versions and things like that. That includes, we also need to do this for staging, of course. Then we need to build some info automation for failing over, failing back, scaling up and down, a secondary side. And we need to be able to support deployments there without database migrations. And we need to think about how to test all of this. So this is work that we know that needs to be done regardless of what we are planning for synchronization. So that could be started right now already with some constraints. And we had a meeting with Maren and Skarbek together to discuss this a little bit. And we tried to put the actionable work of that into an epic. I linked it below. You can see it here in the document. And another fact that I also want to point out is if you want to get a better RTO for our premium customers, then we need to come up with a syncing solution besides disk snapshots or something like Geo is doing right now, or using something like, I don't know, ZFS streaming replication or other technologies, or even ideally having GitLab using object storage, but I think that's the far future. And a missing piece of work for that would also be that we have the ability in the application to get selective syncing in GitLab by plan. And I think this is the condensed discussion we had over the last few weeks, I think, for what needs to be done. And so I opened up this epic below, put in some points of what could be started right now. And I wanted to put it here as a discussion point of next step to be done. At least for infrastructure, I think there's a lot of work falling out of this now. And other work is needed to be done by development, like in our application for selective sync, for Geo, I guess. Things like being able to make Geo work in Kubernetes and these things, if we decide to go with the solution. So that's the thing we are waiting on from infrastructure side, so to say. Yeah, before going over to the next point where Davis had a lot of questions, maybe I wait first for feedback for the things I mentioned here.
If you don't mind, Henry, I'll just want to summarize the recording without actually saying everything that we talked about in there. You can watch the recording and check the epic out. But the general discussion we had was, we have no time to do this. We have no people assigned to do this. We have strict restrictions on how much money we can spend on this. And we have a timeline that is very short. So with all those things combined, it's really hard to find these big discussions, or fund rather these big discussions of what will happen if Geo has selective sync, what will happen if GitLab supports object storage, right? So what we were discussing in this call is what can we do right now that will support this effort, regardless of the application having this support, to get us to a point where we have some sort of RTO or RPO. I know that the business is requesting 1 hour one. We have like 1,000 hour one right now, right? Like we have nothing. So what can we do right now to start going towards that point, to see how much money we will spend with that high number anyway, and whether the number we quoted will be even achievable. And then we can talk about optimizations and so on. So one of the paths that we were talking about is how to save cost. Is if we think about what our secondary site is going to be. So instead of talking about VMs on the secondary site in general, what if the secondary site is more Kubernetes cluster than VM oriented? What if only Redis and the database is the VM part, and Gitly is still part of the Kubernetes cluster? That is like point number 3. So we were talking about like, what would that give us? And I think the agreement in general was it would save us the orchestration effort. The orchestration effort, the thing that we are actually missing right now. If we fail over to a secondary site that is mostly Kubernetes, we can roll the nodes just by changing configuration, and Kubernetes would handle the orchestration for us. So the general lines of work we talked about are, let's build out the database cluster that we need on the secondary site anyway, whether we support VMs or Kubernetes. From the GitLab side, we need the database. We'll need Redis as well. And then at that point, once we have that up and running, we would test a couple of options. One option would be, what happens if Gitly is within the cluster, Kubernetes cluster, connecting to storage somewhere else, right? Like a snapshot or something else. That would mean that on a failover, in a failover situation, we would focus only on restoring the Gitly data, right? Rather than focus on also scaling the application, also adding more nodes, also dealing with a bunch of other things. So that would save us a lot of time there. And as we develop that story and as we get more information of where we can say what we can invest in, that is the track that infrastructure team can work on, while the development teams figure out what are you going to do with syncing, right? Is Geo going to be the one supporting selective syncing, or Gitly is going to be the one like that? I'm leaving up to the development side to figure out how are you going to figure out the selective repository story, right? And at some point, those stories are going to start overlapping a bit, but we will have more information at that point so we can inform ourselves a bit better. Before I end with this tiny rant, this also means that Skarbek and Henri, who are the DRIs for the Kubernetes migration, will first and foremost focus on the Kubernetes migration, and the secondary thing will be the build out of the secondary site components that we need, unless something changes. If we get another requirement coming our way to do some other work, the disaster recovery falls from that line, right? Kubernetes migration is still over that top. So it really depends also on what kind of timelines and resources and people we can get to do this work, because only 2 people work on this from the infra side. All right, cool.
Thanks, you summarized that much better than I did.
You did well, don't worry. Gonna ask, is there any feedback on that? Any concerns, anything? Or are you still processing the information dump?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I would be aligned with that approach. That's kind of how I was thinking about it. And I talked with Brent a little bit last week about this, of like, let's let's start with a reasonable MVC where we can actually get to the point where we can recover from a disaster and not really worry too much about RTO and RPO. And once we develop the capability, continue iterating on that and eventually try to get the RTO and RPO down to, you know, the target that we're looking for. But I realize, like, we're resource constrained, that's going to take a long time to get there. We also will likely need features built by Gitly and possibly Geo. So I think that makes sense from my perspective.
Yeah, I think there I have a couple of comments. So I like that we're, if I understand correctly, we're going into a direction where we're saying some disaster recovery capability is better than no disaster recovery capability. And let's do that first, right? Because then we actually have something that we believe works. Right? I think that's good. I think I'm also aligned with being a little bit pragmatic with regards to technology choices to accomplish that, right? I think that makes sense. I think one thing that I would like to tease out a little bit is that what we're talking about here is really what needs to happen on production, right? I think Nick had some a comment on that as well, right? Like, because the realization is that given the cost constraints, the current capabilities of the product, any other combination like of features that we have in Geo would require, or Gitly would require development effort, right, to go to production. I think that is kind of where we are at, right? Because the avenue that we explored theoretically is like Geo, for example, can actually sync selectively, right, on shards, and we could do that for Premium Plus data, but then we box ourselves in with the free users, right, and reconciling that, which is difficult. Right? If we just use Geo as is, it would be too expensive on the storage side, so it falls out of that bucket. So what we really need to come up with is a solution to do this in a cost-efficient way at scale, right? And that may require some work from Gitly, for example, to object storage or whatever it ends up being, right? So the shortcoming here is really on controlling cost, right, at that scale. I think the question, I think what we should avoid doing is when we do something in production to like deploy it in such a way that it is incompatible with anything that we're going to build, out in hopefully later stages, so that we can't actually migrate or like iterate on top of what we have, right? I think that's hopefully understood, and that should be fine. Because I think my intent would be to say, like, if we arrive at a solution for the R, and maybe it's 48 hours, that's clearly not enough maybe for some users, and maybe we want to be better at differentiating this for premium users. So we need to have a way to bring that down eventually, right? And I think that's maybe something that we can lay out a little bit more in the product side of things in terms of like how that could look like. But I think that's a little bit further down the line, like, I don't know, 6 months or something.
Yeah, and I think this is why it's important for you folks to continue building out the staging secondary site for now with Get, so that we have something to figure out, to test with as you're working towards things, right? Together with what we are doing also on the infra side. So those tracks are kind of parallel as well. So you'll have to show us, we'll still have to do failovers so we can actually see what happens exactly. And then at some point, we'll get to the point where we cross and say like, okay, now we know. The whole point of this like couple of tracks is to ensure that we don't go down the route of snapshot restoration, because that is the manual part. Rather, let me rephrase that. We have that as an option, but we haven't really investigated whether we can get away from that option. So basically run away from that option and just fall back on it if all else fails. And I don't want us to like formulate a solution around a snapshot right now. And that's what you're saying as well, right? That is where we kind of buying ourselves a bit of time by running these things in parallel.
I think that makes sense.
that was the whole idea, I think, to build something which is usable regardless of which syncing solution we end up with, right? And we even in the epic have a point to make Geo work with Kubernetes, because we are planning for, you know, standing up as much as we can in Kubernetes, and we want to have Geo working there, right? So we could use it as a solution. So we would love to use it, because right now it's, I think, the best working solution for syncing GitLab data that we have. We just need to solve the selective syncing part out of course constraints, right? And we can just right now start working, setting this up, the infrastructure part, and then see that we can make it work with Geo when it is ready, right? And so that's the goal of the whole discussion, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do think we should. I'll connect with Mark Woods again, you know, because I think there is this interesting intersection of like being able to store Git data in object storage may still like maybe a very beneficial thing to do for many use cases, right? As well. So maybe there is an opportunity to accelerate that as well, but I don't know how that looks. I have another quick question that's maybe a little bit too technical, but building out the secondary site, even if you don't use Geo for syncing anything, right, may actually still make sense to build it as a Geo secondary site, right, in a read-only state, you know, with everything set up in a way that allows you to like replicate data, you know, that you then can promote. But I don't know if that is sensible, but that would future-proof it to some extent and would allow us to help with, you know, streamlining that process, which is something that we would need to do anyways. But we can talk about that at a different time.
Okay, so I have heard. So I wonder if I lost the context here. Looks like looking through some comments to my question, looks like we are talking about having Geo to be the DR solution for a production environment. I think this working group is to dogfood Geo as a solution for DR, and starting from the staging environment to see how that works. And we still don't have the secondary as a cluster yet. And also the fact is that Geo is not enabled for production environment. And there are multiple steps towards that Geo is a DR solution for production. Are we just jumping the hoops to the ultimate goal? I mean, there are just multiple steps towards that Geo is using Geo as a DR for production environment. We don't have Geo in production yet.
Yeah, my understanding is that there's kind of these parallel tracks happening, like Maren described, like on one, like we're talking about dogfooding Geo, starting with staging and seeing what the gaps are. But my understanding is also from the infra side, like we don't really have any disaster recovery right now, and infrastructure is figuring out what they can do to get something in place, which should also help inform what gaps Geo or GitLab as well might need to fill. Does that understanding sound correct? So I think maybe at the outside of the group, we were specifically focusing on Geo and staging and kind of this step-by-step process like you're describing, Chun, but I think along the way, it's kind of evolved to also just talk about the more general disaster recovery on production requirement and maybe what can be done in addition, like knowing that identifying these gaps that Geo has and you know what needs to be done on the development side will take a while. So I think that understanding of the purpose of the working group has sort of evolved a bit to encompass these dual tracks, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. In that sense, I think this working group scope is expanded, somehow expanded.
I think what happened is that actually the working group really served as a forum to kickstart some of these discussions and to think a little bit more like to really sort of explore what can we do, right? like right now, but also where do we want to go? So I think, yes, it has maybe expanded a little bit in scope, but I think that's actually a good thing because it triggered, I think, some discussions around, hey, you know, if we want to do this within this cost envelope, what does that actually mean, right? For example, and so, yeah.
Yeah, no problem to expand that scope, but we may want to document that in the working group handbook page that now this is the scope. Instead of, I mean, initially we were just thinking like dogfooding the geo as a DR solution on the staging and see how geo works for staging and then make a conclusion, identify the gaps, then move on to develop the solution for a full disaster recovery solution.
But aren't we doing that right now, Chun? I'm a bit confused and I'm tired. It's the end of the day for me as well. I thought that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, but what I was confused is we are talking about the production environment now. So I think it's a little bit too early to talk about the production environment. We don't have a DR for staging.
Oh,
yet.
right. Okay. Let's clear this something up. This is why I mentioned that the Geo team, Nick, still needs to continue building out the GET secondary site with GET so that we have something to test. This is also why I said that we still need to build out, you know, the clusters that we need for stateful data in order to be able to play with this. Like, actual production story is much farther away. We are just using it as a model of how are we going to get there. Like, we can't put anything in production right now because we just don't have any tool at all, a single thing.
That's my confusion. I was thinking that we are talking about how to get this thing to the production. I think we are still too far from there.
Right, but in infrastructure, you can't put anything in production directly. It needs to go through some steps. So I guess that's where the gap is coming from, right? Like, any service that we put forward, it goes through pre-staging and then only production. So I think for us, it's not even a discussion. Like, it's a normal set of steps that we go through.
Yeah, to me, this working group is to identify the product gaps of Geo and experiment with staging to find those gaps. Then the development teams can fill those functional gaps, then get the Geo ready for production. That's the ultimate goal. But this working group, we are using staging as a vehicle to test our solution.
I don't necessarily understand this. Yeah, go ahead, Henry.
I think to evaluate Geo as a solution for disaster recovery, we need to think about what our disaster recovery needs to look like to support GitLab.com, right? I mean, because that's why we are looking to evaluate Geo. And for that, we need to think about how we would fail over at the scale of GitLab.com. And this discussion happened, right? So we discovered the problems and the codes and also what that would mean, so that we need to have support in Geo for selective syncing and things like that. And now that we thought about this and got these gaps in Geo, for instance, or maybe it's even mostly there, now we know that we can try to do this in staging as a test, right? And build up something like a copy of staging, try to get Geo as a syncing mechanism for selective syncing, build up the steps of, you know, orchestrating failing over, failing back, and these other steps that we need to test before we can go to production. But we can only identify the gaps in Geo if you think about the production environment, because we need to plan for the scale, right? So I think we just need to meet in the middle now, and we need to come from both sides to make it useful. So I think we are still, let's go.
I think we are aligned. I mean, what I was looking at this, we are testing on staging and developing the solution for the production. So I think we are aligned here. It's basically the testing is on the staging, but we are trying to get a solution for the production.
Well, there is a simple way of getting off the Geo story, and that is Fabian and Andrew come back and tell us that product doesn't want to support, or GitLab part doesn't want to support syncing to object storage, right? Syncing all the free repositories to object storage, or a cost-effective way of handling the storage story. If we get that information, this working group moves away from Geo, because we have now we have a number that we need to find a way to hit. And if Geo can't offer that, we need to find an alternative. But I think everyone in this call absolutely wants to figure out how to get this from Geo.
No, I think actually maybe we could update our page for the working group, because I think the main two gaps that were identified in this process, were the controlling the cost of replicating very large amounts of Git data. I think that is it. Right? It's like, because, and we don't have the ability to sort of subset data and reconcile it at a later stage without issues, right? I think that's another thing that we can't do. So these are two things that are difficult. And then there is maybe the automation piece that we talked about, right? Like how to actually promote, with not as much manual intervention. And those are, I think, the things that Geo/Gitly may need to account for, right? Because the business requirements as we have them right now for controlling the cost are such that we can't just replicate everything on regular Gitly storage. I think that's the main thing. And that may require development either within Geo or within Gitly, more likely to support different ways of doing that. And I think this is kind of some really good findings, I think, for sort of going to production scale, but most of these things don't apply to the same extent in staging, right? So it doesn't really block that at this moment to like set these things up. That's how I see it, at least.
Yep. And again, just to add to that, like if none of that works out, the work that Infra is doing to build out the stateful nodes, we'll have to do that anyway for us for any type of DR story, whether that's Geo or not Geo, right? So this is where we're kind of trying to parallelize some of that work. And also, like, I'm hoping that by tying this to the Kubernetes migration, we actually expose also how important that migration is for the general cost saving efforts and performance and scaling efforts that we have. I'll put something forward to update the page of the working group. There is quite a lot that has happened actually. So
yeah, I'm happy to help with that and review or update as well.
Yeah, thanks. All right, we are at time. Davis, there is a question that you put forward. Can that be moved for the next call, or is it important to handle it now?
Yeah, I think we can merge the next one. I think you all touched on it when you were talking as well. And I think I'll talk with Andrew about it more to see like what we can do with Gitly around this, if that's reasonable, because it does sound like all the it keeps pointing back to this problem, right, around object storage and Gitly. So I think it's worth the discussion, probably in the next call, but also offline as well.
Cool. Thanks. All right. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of the day.